Ghostwire Tokyo. This is a game that came out last year, back in March of 2022, and it's this open-world sandbox action-adventure game where you're transported to this version of Tokyo where people have disappeared and it's plagued by supernatural elements, and it's this first-person shooter where instead of shooting guns, you basically shoot like Naruto jutsus and stuff. Really cool aesthetics, really cool concept, and generally I feel like this game was received positively. Now, only now has the game launched on Xbox, and Ghostwire Tokyo is a special occasion, or a special case rather, where this is a game that's published by Bethesda, which is now a subsidiary of Microsoft's after Microsoft acquired ZeniMax, and yet it came out on PlayStation first because Bethesda had signed a one-year exclusivity deal for Ghostwire Tokyo before Microsoft acquired Bethesda, so it's this technically first-party Xbox game or Microsoft game that came out on PlayStation first, and now a year later, it's finally come to Xbox. Unfortunately, this is a game that performs significantly worse on Xbox compared to PlayStation, which is not a good look when you consider that Ghostwire Tokyo is technically a first-party Xbox game that, yes, was made for the PlayStation 5, but they had a year to make this port, to flesh it out, to make sure that it runs appropriately. But apparently it just runs significantly worse on Xbox. The performance is just not where it should be. This was all uncovered by outlet Digital Foundry, who specialize in breaking down graphics and performance for games. They tweeted, yes, Ghostwire Tokyo on Series X doesn't match PS5 performance and has lower resolution ray tracing, but the key criticism is that problems with last year's PS5 game haven't been addressed, and they're still present on the Xbox version. You can watch the full Digital Foundry analysis here in this video titled Ghostwire Tokyo Xbox Tech Review. You can see right here, just this one screenshot alone shows a significant disparity between the Xbox version and the PS5 version. The PS5 version, in this particular mode, the performance, high frame rate, VSync 120 FPS mode, it tends to run at 10 frames higher on PlayStation 5 compared to Xbox. And even then, you see a lot of instability, a lot of highs and lows, a lot of fluctuations. When it comes to modes that try to lock the frame rate at like 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second, be it quality mode or performance mode, the PS5 version just tends to be a lot more stable, whereas the Xbox version just tends to see more frame rate dips that make the experience feel a bit more stuttery. And this is evidenced by reviews like this one from Jez. He said, I reviewed Ghostwire Tokyo on Xbox. The story's solid, the gameplay satisfying eventually, but the performance on Xbox Series X is haunting. So it's not just Digital Foundry who has experienced this. And this is just baffling a lot of people, like Alexander Battaglia, who makes content for Digital Foundry. He tweeted, I have no idea how this was released 1 year later, does not fix the issues on PS5, and manages to run worse and look worse. What is the point of first party if not to make the first party Xbox version shine? Again, I know the game was originally made for PS5, but you had a year to make sure that the Xbox version was potentially the best version, given that Ghostwire Tokyo does represent the Xbox brand now as a first-party title coming from Bethesda, which is a studio now, or a company now that's been acquired by Microsoft. A deeper breakdown can be found in this Eurogamer article that essentially summarizes what Digital Foundry discovered about this game running on Xbox. But before we delve into that, while Ghostwire Tokyo may not have used its time effectively to make a good Xbox port, you know what is a good use of your time? Learning a new language. Il che ci porta allo sponsor del video di oggi, Babbel. That's Italian for this brings us to the sponsor of today's video, Babbel, a platform dedicated to helping you master new languages. Babbel is one of the top language apps in the world with lessons designed by real language teachers. Over 10 million people have subscribed to begin their linguistic journey, and having used the app myself, I can see why so many people are drawn to it. I've always been interested in expanding my repertoire of languages, especially as a professional actor and voiceover artist, and being fluent in English, Spanish, and conversational Korean, I thought this would be a great opportunity to branch off into languages like Italian. Having done some Italian lessons through Babbel, I was impressed by how comprehensive Babbel is, covering listening comprehension, reading, spelling, and speaking.
Piacere, io mi chiamo Andrea.
Piacere, io mi chiamo Andrea. varying activities and quizzes in intuitive and engaging ways that constantly encourage your brain to memorize, make connections, and be aware of not just the words, sentences, and conversations, but the real-world situations in which they'll be used. Whether it's for travel, for work, for relationships, or just for self-improvement, it's never too late to learn a new language or brush up on a language and expand your versatility. And you can get started by clicking on the link in the description box below to get 60% off your Babbel subscription with a 20-day money-back guarantee. Alright, so back to Ghostwire Tokyo. Here is Eurogamer's breakdown of issues that plague the Xbox version of this game. I've highlighted key bits of information like Ghostwire Tokyo ships with a sobering variety of visual modes, far too many on PS5 and Xbox Series X. There are 10 visual options for players to choose from. I do agree that is way too much. Many of them just aren't all that effective or recommendable. Graphically speaking, though, when we bring in the PS5 release, it's evident that the Xbox Series X is getting a somewhat compromised experience. Ray tracing effects are somewhat higher resolution on the Sony platform, and there are some small cutbacks on Series X that look a little odd. It's not a huge difference, but the RT is subtly degraded on the Xbox. I feel like for the majority of players, you'd have to use a microscope to gauge these differences, but it's worth noting that not only does the Xbox version run worse in the PS5 version, but it also looks a little worse as well. Quality modes on Series X get pin-sharp, stencil-like shadows on certain bits of interior detail. It's a nice effect, but the slightly diffuse look of the shadow maps can look a bit more realistic depending on scene lighting. Plus, in a couple of areas, the RT shadows on Series X actually seemed misaligned, with light cast through walls and coming out at awkward angles. Ray tracing shadows do look substantially better on PS5 when these alignment issues surface. And just across the board, apparently the quality mode on PlayStation 5 just looks better, looks slightly sharper and more coherent, in addition to its ray tracing advantages. The Xbox Series X version, on top of its graphical fidelity, just suffering a little bit compared to the PlayStation 5 version. Resolution-wise, there's a deficit for Series X in the quality mode that is apparently noticeable. But again, for the majority of people, these are graphical differences that will go unnoticed unless you put these two side by side under a microscope like Digital Foundry does. But performance is something you can tangibly feel. When the game's a little stuttery, when the frame rate isn't stable, or when it's not running at 60 frames per second, that's just something that your body, your brain will tangibly perceive, and it can have a negative impact on your gameplay experience, especially in a game like Ghostwire Tokyo, where it's very action heavy and where your reflexes, your reaction time, and your ability to aim properly by having that one-to-one connection with the player character, all of that stuff really matters. It is stated right here that performance is where things really break down for Ghostwire Tokyo. The game just doesn't run well at all. The new Xbox versions actually perform worse than the existing PS5 release, and the PS5 version had its host of issues that were pointed out by Digital Foundry when the game launched back then. Starting with the Series X version, the worst performing option here is the game's quality mode. 30 FPS is the target here, and it's reached quite consistently, but it's plagued by improper frame pacing, providing a jerky, inconsistent motion that in practice feels like the game is running at a lower update. I think that's a typo. I think this is meant to say that in practice the game feels like it's running at a lower frame rate, which is the problem that plagued Bloodborne running on PlayStation 4. You may recall that game generally ran at 30 FPS, but everything just felt a lot more stuttery than it should. Frame pacing was the issue for that, which is why a lot of people are hoping for a Bloodborne remaster. And with Ghostwire Tokyo, again, being such an action-heavy game, having those frame pacing issues can be a significant detriment to the gameplay experience, as it could be with Bloodborne. So yeah, the frame pacing issues on the quality mode is really unfortunate for those who prefer that experience. And then when it comes to performance mode, unfortunately, while the goal is a consistent 60 frames per second, typically we're sitting at 50 to 60 FPS on the Xbox version, with a constant barrage of dropped frames during open world gameplay. And then there's quality mode with high frame rate and VSync at 60 Hz output. Unfortunately, it too comes saddled with substandard performance. When frame rate constantly fluctuates, rises and dips and whatnot, that's when you feel like the game is like speeding up then slowing down, and that's when it can get disorienting. And in the case of this mode, we're hovering around 45 to 60 FPS in typical play, rather than a consistent 60, or even a consistent 45 would be preferable. And then there's the unlocked frame rate mode that sees the game toggle a 120 Hz mode, but unfortunately that too operates with wobbly, unlocked performance. It's got an unstable frame time readout. There are time spikes that are pushing certain frames above 16 milliseconds. The 120 Hz mode is how we're seeing the PS5 version run the game at like 90 frames per second, with the Xbox version typically running that mode at 10 frames per second lower. It'll likely make for a much smoother experience than the 60 Hz modes and stuff like that, but the instability of the frame rate again can be felt. Comparing that to the PS5 version of the game on PlayStation 5, the performance mode operates with a considerable advantage, about 10 frames per second or so. The 60 Hz mode option, the PS5 version, does not suffer any dips. It does not suffer those significant stutters you experience on Xbox. The PS5 version manages to hold closer to 60 FPS than the Series X, but the PS5 version is certainly not the paragon of performance. It's still ultimately disappointing to see that there's still the same issues a year on from launch, except now with the Xbox version, the situation has actually gotten worse. And the Series S, that version you probably don't want to get. It runs considerably worse than either of the higher-end console platforms, PS5 and Series X. And then on top of that, the Series X version has a problem that's unique to it that the PS5 version does not suffer from. Non-V-synced modes operate with heavy screen tearing, so they don't seem to be working with variable refresh rate properly. And then last but not least, on top of the unstable performance, further exacerbating the gameplay experience are input issues that plagued the PS5 version that remain unresolved on the Series consoles. Ghostwire Tokyo's input issues are still a big problem on Series X. Camera movement still feels laggy with awkward seeming acceleration that when you pair with the unstable frame rate or the performance stutters, it just makes for an action-adventure experience that is less than ideal. This is just not a good look for the Xbox platform as a whole, especially when this comes in shortly after the Xbox exclusive Redfall announced that at launch it would not have a performance mode. A 60 FPS performance mode will be added via game update at a later date. At launch, it'll only have a 30 FPS mode. And Redfall being an action-intensive first-person shooter, this is far from ideal for this particular genre. And then Starfield, Todd Howard has hinted that it'll likely run at 30 FPS on Xbox Series X/S. It'll likely not have a performance mode. There's a quote from a podcast that he was a part of recently where he said, "We're okay with 30 frames per second as long as it looks really good and the simulation is running," and all of those things. Starfield, while primarily a role-playing game, does have first-person shooter combat, and so it's disappointing that this generation of consoles, which is supposed to elevate the hardware power to a whole new level and allow for up to 120 Hertz, 120 FPS, like we're still at a point where we are trying to normalize 30 FPS, which, look, is like playable enough, I suppose, but it's really just not ideal. At the very least, make 45 FPS the floor and 60 FPS the ideal frames per second. At the very least, let's get that far. I just don't feel like 30 FPS should be a thing anymore for action-intensive games, or players should be given the option between a performance and quality mode. And, you know, when you compare how PlayStation has been releasing their big first-party games where they not only have a quality mode versus performance mode, but also things in between where you can run games at a locked 45 FPS and stuff like that, it's just like night and day difference. And I hope that Xbox games can, the first party ones in particular, can just find a way to not make 30 FPS the standard, or at the very least the only option for the kinds of games where 60 FPS is highly beneficial for players to feel just more connected, for them to feel like they can react better, and for the game to just feel smoother. Especially when folks like Aaron Greenberg, VP of Xbox Games Marketing at Microsoft, said back in 2020 that 60 FPS will be the standard output for Xbox Series X, but the architecture allows us to support up to 120 FPS. Now, Microsoft did put out the disclaimer that it is ultimately up to individual developers to determine how they leverage the power and speed of Xbox Series X, but I still feel like if you are releasing first-party games that are meant to show just how powerful your console is, how well games perform on it, you should be leading the way in ensuring that your first-party games made specifically for Xbox really shine, really highlight what this console can do, both in terms of graphics fidelity and performance, just how flexible this console can be. And I just feel like Xbox with, the Redfall frame rate limitations, with Starfield seemingly not having a performance mode, and now with, Ghostwire Tokyo, even a year after its launch, having a year to port this game over to Xbox and make it the best it can be, and having such unstable performance, it's just not a good look. So that's kind of where we're at with Ghostwire Tokyo, ladies and gentlemen, and the optics that this all places on the Xbox platform as a whole. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the Ghostwire Tokyo port for Xbox. And if you've played it, have you been experiencing performance issues that have been reported widely? Share your thoughts on all of this in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.